I tried a consultancy and I didn't really like it because I got back into the companies and the office politics, and I was like, I don't want to do this. So I just decided to continue with the writing, and I just became a copywriter, and it hadn't really crossed my mind because I'm not a native speaker, as you can hear, and I really didn't think at that stage that people would hire me to write for them in English, but that happened.
Hello and welcome to the Write Podcast. I'm your host, Julia McCoy. Join me as I interview experts in the field and discuss hot content, copywriting, and marketing topics. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to episode 39 in the Write Podcast. Today, I am so excited because I have one of my copywriting heroes here today on the show as my guest, Henneke Duistermaat. There are so many reasons why I love what Henneke does, but to start, here's what Brian Clark, the founder of Copyblogger, says about her. Quote, "You should follow Hennekes every word," end quote. If you aren't reading her blog at enchantingmarketing.com, you definitely should. It's great, amazing copy. She's been featured in Inc., Forbes. She's taught copywriting webinars at Unbounce and AWeber, and her writing has been featured on many top publications. I'm so excited to have you on the show, Henneke, and thank you for, being patient while I was bugging you, I think over the past year, about coming on my show.
Yeah, well, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I'm so glad we connected, and I'm really excited to talk about engaging copywriting with you, because I don't know if you've ever been called this, but you are kind of the queen of that with your blog. You're just so good at writing engaging copy.
Yeah, thank you. That's what it is about to me. I really write to connect with my audience, so engagement is important for me.
In the past few years, working with agencies, freelancers, that is such a difficult skill to obtain and grow into. It's like a big question mark for a lot of marketers. So I'm really excited that we're going to chat about that today. So to start, I love reading about you and your story. That one part of your story is that you started enchanting marketing in 2012, and you've been able to really dive into doing what you love today, which is writing and blogging. So can you take us through just a little bit of your story, and in what capacity do you currently work online today?
My story is actually a little weird and quite different from most writers because I really never saw myself as a writer, and I didn't really think I could write. And it was only when I worked as a marketer for a small company, and content marketing became more and more important. And so I just thought it's just becoming impossible to do a good marketing job without being able to write. So I somehow got over my idea that I couldn't write and that I had to learn it. So I decided to learn how to write, and then actually I found that I really enjoyed writing. And then I quit my corporate job and I started guest posting on big blogs, and it was really it was a bit of a trial, I still wasn't envisioning myself as a writer, and and my plan was to take a sabbatical and just do some things for fun and try out. And then somehow, because I was writing about writing, because I was writing about what I was learning about writing.
That's awesome.
And that really clicked with people, and they just asked me to hire them. My bio at that time didn't even say that I was a writer. I had this idea in mind that I might be able to be a consultant in content marketing, because my background was in marketing, so I thought I could make that work. But I tried a consultancy and I didn't really like it because I got back into the companies and the office politics, and I was like, I don't want to do this. So I just decided to continue with the writing, and I just became a copywriter, and and it hadn't really crossed my mind because I'm not a native speaker, as you can hear. And I really didn't think at that stage that people would hire me to write for them in English, but that happened. So I then, did copywriting projects and a little bit of freelance blogging, but not a lot. I mainly blogged for my own business and guest posting to build my list. And then I started writing books, and teaching courses. And that is what my main business is now. I don't do any freelance copywriting anymore. I just teach people how to write more persuasively, and I help people find their voice.
That's amazing. I really connect with your story because in my own agency, the number one way we market ourselves is that I create content. So that content pulls in people that go, oh, that's good content. I want you to write for me. So yeah. That's the same story. I love that.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. And now it works like, wow, I love your writing. I want to write like you, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to push up one question because you mentioned this, and I think this is a great question for you. In your story, overcoming that barrier as a non-native writer, today I interact with so many potential writers. They have amazing work ethics. They come in ready to work, but there is that barrier there of not having English as their native language. So what are some tips that you would give them to help overcome that barrier? How did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from native English speakers. So initially I would have my content checked by native speakers, and I just paid attention to their corrections. So I knew I would make the same mistakes again. Wow. So I think when you are, my mother tongue is Dutch. And initially when I wrote English, then I would use sometimes like Dutch grammar, or Dutch structure in an English sentence. And I wouldn't realize I was doing that. So when native speakers said, this sounds a little weird, this is how I would write it, then I would sort of really try and remember that, make a note of it and think like, okay, I shouldn't do this again, because this is wrong in English. So I learned a lot from that. And I also, I read almost only English. And I think that really helps to really, get the English writing rhythm right, and to expand my vocabulary. I also use the thesaurus a lot just to stop myself from using the same words all the time. But I'm very careful when I find a word that I'm sort of vaguely familiar with, but I'm not 100% sure about. I would always double check it in a dictionary, because sometimes with a thesaurus you get really informal words. And
true.
They wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for what I'm writing. Or it would be, I try to avoid also when I write like real American slang. And I don't really always have this radar to know, is this very local? Is this very American? Or is this British English? And I've been caught out a couple of times, that I'm writing something and that happened to have a different meaning in American English than British English. And I just didn't realize, because I read a lot of American English, but I live in the UK. My language is a bit odd sometimes. But I think sometimes that is okay as well. It has a charm as long as you don't confuse people. I think it's fine. So, and I think we also should realize that, native speakers don't write flawless English either.
True.
Everybody has his own quirks and everybody makes mistakes. And, in my courses, I correct the grammar of native English speakers. So, don't be afraid that your grammar is necessarily worse than that of native English speakers. And if you're concerned, then work with a language coach or a good proofreader or an editor, get some feedback.
That's such a good tip, to work with a proofreader. And it's so simple, I think, to go and do that. But the fact that you studied their corrections and really, memorized some of that and then took that into everything you wrote. So how long were you working with a proofreader, would you say, at the beginning? Was it like a full year? Was it a few months?
I mean, it's a bit difficult to say because I started writing when I worked at a company, and then there were always colleagues to check. So that was happening maybe for a year or 2 years, but I wasn't writing full time. And then when I started guest posting before I started writing my own blog. And at that stage, the guest posts are always checked by editors too. So I learned from them. For my own blog, I'm not very organized, so I often work I am organized, but not organized enough to have my writing ready to have it proofread by someone else. So my blog is proofread by my readers, but they don't often find something, It occasionally happens that I get an email and something is wrong. But when I write books or courses, then yes, I would hire a proofreader for that.
Everything you said about, not even worrying too much that your grammar as a non-native writer or speaker is not as good as someone who has that as their native language. That's so true because, even in my journey, I have learned so much from the people I work with. For example, whenever I was writing for the Shopify guest blog, Aaron Orendorff was my editor, and he was extremely tough on me. And I learned so much from his corrections, like things that I'd been writing for the past 7 years, but what he was teaching me with those edits was so important for better clarity in my copy. So I think that's such a good point.
Yeah, you can learn so much from other people and working with them and getting them to provide feedback. So yeah, I would always recommend that.
Yes, It's almost like you have tunnel vision if it's just you and your words without that really important collaborative feedback.
Yeah. And also one other thing about non-native speakers, I think sometimes it is an advantage as well, because we can be a little bit more creative sometimes with language. We're less stuck in how we're supposed to say things. So I think, turn it around sometimes and see the positive side. And I get people sometimes emailing me about worrying that their writing is too simple. And I say, hooray. It's good if it's simple because sometimes people just write too academically, too.
So true.
Yeah, they use too many difficult words. They write to impress rather than to explain their ideas. And yeah, that's not good either. So simplicity is good.
So true. There was a blog I wrote, I think in the past, I want to say 6 months, and it was a play on AP English. And in this blog, I took a screenshot of a typical syllabus for an English course, something like English 102. And that entire syllabus, none of those rules that were presented there really applied to how to write a blog. And it's really hard because if you go to college here in the States, that's what you learn. You don't necessarily learn, how do I optimize a blog header? How do I write a creative introduction to my blog? So that's a really good point. Sometimes you have to unlearn whenever English is your native language.
Yeah. Yeah, at school they teach you often to use very long languages and they like you using complicated words, but often that is not the right way to go.
Yes, essay writing is nothing like online writing.
Yeah.
So different. Well, another question I have for you, one reason that your copywriting has always stood out to me is because of the way that you draw your character with every single blog post. Am I right to say that character's name is Henrietta?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love that you do that. And you're so dedicated to put the effort into illustration as well as writing. One thing I love to do in my spare time is draw and paint, but I don't have the time to combine that with writing. So I love that you have put the effort into doing that so consistently over time. And I'm sure that's one reason, your blog stands out from the thousands of other blogs out there. So what's your process when it comes to both writing and illustrating for a blog?
Yeah, Henrietta is actually the English version of my name.
Oh,
so
cool.
she's, I mean, that's the closest. It's not really an equivalent, but it doesn't exist. But it's the closest that exists. So she's my alter ego. And I think of her as a bit more outgoing and a bit braver than myself. So she inspires me. I was just like I never thought I was a writer. I didn't think I was somebody who could draw either. And I hadn't been drawing since middle school. But I really hated the boring stock photography. And there was this cartooning teacher who said that, it's Sean de Souza, who said he could teach anybody to draw. So I decided to give it a go. And that's how I started Henrietta. And she's a big part of my blog now, it seems. So yeah, the process, I mean, most of the time writing is still the key. So the drawing usually comes after the writing, but sometimes when I'm stuck with writing, I start drawing. Or if I feel like, I don't know, if I get bored with my writing, sometimes I decide, okay, this needs more illustrations. So I start writing. Or, I start drawing then. And I've done some infographics as well that are more drawing than writing, of course. So my process is really to write over a series of days. I usually pick an idea maybe on a Wednesday or Thursday and just only scribble down some ideas about what I would write. I mean, I have a notebook full of ideas that I just jot down when I get ideas, and maybe sometimes I just spend half an hour just specifically to generating ideas. But I don't do that often, maybe twice a year. Usually I have enough ideas because every blog post you write, there's always another loose end and you can write about it another time, dive deeper into something. So, so I would pick an idea and just write a few, it's like a rough outline of what I could write about it. And I really like then not to start writing. It's just, because you have some time to let it percolate in your mind, just let it simmer a little bit. So I would write a first draft, then usually the next day. I'm really a night owl. I'm more energetic in the evening, but I found that I write my first drafts actually best first thing in the morning. So I would always write my first draft even before breakfast, I'm not an early riser, but I'm usually not that hungry. So I just shower and I avoid the news because the news always puts me in a bad mood. So I don't want my writing mood to be spoiled. So I just, make a cup of tea and I set a timer and I start writing. And usually I can write a first draft in 2 chunks of 25 minutes. And that's about 1,000 words. And then I just leave it. Sometimes it's decent. Sometimes it's not so decent yet. It can be quite crappy. Sometimes I really have to force myself just to get it down. But okay, that's my blogging work done for the day. And I'll wait a day before I start revising and editing. And usually I don't write the opening, closing on the first day either. So I write just the main body of the post. And then the next day I might write the opening and the closing, and I might edit it. And then another day I would do a final round of editing and proofreading and make the picture. I really find when you write over more days that firstly, I'm really I used to be a really bad procrastinator. And by spreading the words over more days, each step became so small that it's much more difficult to procrastinate because it doesn't feel like a big amount of work anymore. So, And I also find that my content actually gets better because there's actually some thinking about this, Barbara Oatley wrote about it, that there's two different ways of thinking, the very focused and concentrated mode. And that's what you usually do with writing. But there's also a more creative and more diffused kind of thinking where you make creative connections and come up with new ideas. And often this type of thinking, if you're really focused, you can't really be that creative. You don't make these connections because you're really honing into this narrow topic and working on this sentence by sentence. So by working over more days, you can actually make those creative connections just, when you go out for a walk or you wash the dishes, and at once a story pops into your mind that you can use in the blog post, and that will make it more interesting. Or you think of a metaphor, or sometimes I read my headline options in the evening and not really happy with them. And even then, somehow at night when we sleep, our mind still processes ideas. And it does happen then that I wake up in the morning and I just think of a new headline and I think, wow, that's it. I was struggling with this yesterday. Where is this from? So it can really work to cut your work into smaller chunks and just spread it over days.
Yes, I completely agree. Well, the episode, it's funny you mentioned all of that because the episode right before ours was with Jeff Goins. He was on the Right Podcast, and he was speaking about how so many writers try to do everything in one day, and that's actually anti-creative process because our brains were just not meant to handle all aspects of what it takes to produce one good piece of writing. We weren't meant to do all that in one day. So spreading it out is critical to even saving time, getting better results, coming up the next morning with a better headline. All of that is so true. And when I started, I had the mentality of kind of quantity over quality. So I was just, pushing out content just to get it out. And 7 years later, I could not be more the opposite. I have really changed. And now I spend 2-3 weeks on one piece of content. So I completely agree. I think that spreading it out and the way that you use your time is really interesting. Like waking up first thing before you eat, right after you shower, writing. And I read in one of your blogs about how it's a good thing to write when you're groggy. So do you do that? Not to get too personal, but
yeah, not from alcohol, but I do sometimes feel still half asleep in the morning. I'm definitely not at my best, but the research does suggest that we're more creative when we don't necessarily feel at our best. So it is weird. I don't exactly know why it is. I always think it shuts up my inner critic. My inner critic is still asleep, So
True.
I also find, sometimes when I'm have like a bad cold and I don't feel optimal, then I can do quite good work as well because I know all the energy I have to concentrate on the writing. So just don't have time for my inner critic, It's something really bizarre, but it's if you're too ill, it doesn't work. But there is some certain, I don't know, there's something strange about waking up and being half asleep and just doing the work. It was very interesting. I read a book about peak performance, and I can't think of the writers now, but I can give it to you later. And they wrote this book together, and they are early risers, and they actually did the opposite of what I did. They did their creative work in the afternoons, and they did editing in the morning. And I can edit quite well in the afternoon, but writing first drafts in the afternoon is difficult for me. So it's bizarre, and I think it's good to experiment what works for. Yeah, people might be surprised, what you think would work is not necessarily what works.
Definitely. So experimenting with your own creative zone and making that something that you do, not just following, a standard best practice. That's a really good tip.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I hate these blog posts that say the most productive people all get up at 5 a.m.,
Oh, gosh. I agree.
That advice, I mean, that would kill me. I think I would cry. That is
Me
such
too.
bad advice. Everybody really needs to find their own rhythm and optimize it. And yeah, it depends on what else you have to do in your schedule as well, too. Yeah.
Well, to wrap this up, one more question for you. I think a lot of us readers, fans of your blog, we know you for how clear and engaging your copy is. And clarity can be such a hard skill to obtain when you're writing online content. So for writers and bloggers that are struggling to achieve that clarity, just getting really clear with their readers in their copy, what are some top tips? What's like one or two top tip that you would share with them?
Yeah. So one thing I do is really my method. And before I start writing a blog post, I really have a clear idea in my mind of what problem should this blog post solve, and what is then the sunny destination. What if people solve this problem, how does it make them feel? So it can be like, for me, maybe a topic is about my writing voice sounds flat. It's boring. I want some more energy in my writing. So that might be the problem. And then the sunny destination is, if you follow these tips, then your writing will sound more energetic and make your readers happy. So then the whole blog post is about creating this map from the problem, like boring writing, to the sunny destination of having more energy. And that could be, for instance, a blog post about using stronger verbs or using power words or something like that. But I think clarity is really start with really having very clear in your mind, what is this blog post about and what am I going to teach my readers with it and how will it make them feel once they've learned this? I think that is very important. And this is, by the way, also a process that I describe in more detail in my Kindle book, Blog to Win Business.
I'll get that link from you and add that to the show notes.
Yeah, I think if people are writing blog posts, they will find that useful, and it's only a few dollars. So, and then the other tip is to use examples. Examples really make advice more concrete, so people can really see how to implement it and really understand how to do it. I think too often when we're writing, I see this in my courses as well. One of the biggest mistakes is that people make their writing quite abstract and they don't explain concretely how to do something. And if you give an example, then that is concrete. So in a blog post about strong verbs, I will show people what are weak verbs and when do weak verbs make writing sound boring, and how can you then find these verbs and replace them by strong verbs. So examples, or these can be stories or small case studies, whatever. That is so important with clarity.
Love those two tips. Those are excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Right Podcast, Henneke. Really appreciate your time and that you finally came on after I bugged you for such a while.
Yeah, I think I haven't done a podcast for 2 years.
Oh, wow. I feel honored.
Yeah, it was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you got a lot of inspiration out of Henneke's amazing tips on how to get clear with your copy and even produce epic content if you're a non-native writer, and how to get over those fears that are commonly associated with that. So it was an amazing episode and it was awesome to have her on. I wanted to give a quick shout out to the recent mugs that Henneke launched. You could find them at enchantingmarketing.com/mugs-for-writers. This link will also be in our show notes. I am drinking from my own custom Henrietta mug this morning. These are amazing. They feature custom drawn illustrative scenes of Henneke's character, Henrietta. So on the days where I have creative tasks like producing a podcast, writing, I'm often drinking from my Henrietta mug. So these are awesome. Definitely go check that out in the link. You can buy them on Zazzle. And for all the links that were referred to in the show, definitely go check out the show notes. They are always live at expresswriters.com/write-podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the Write Podcast on iTunes. See you next time.